Rose and Henry had been together for over 40 years. Decades of love, struggle, and survival have passed in their marriage. They lived in a small, cozy house in a quiet area, where time seemed to slow down, giving people the opportunity to calmly watch the days pass. Their children had long since moved away, having built their families, and now the house seemed a little empty. All they had left were their memories and habits, which they repeated day after day. Rose stood at the kitchen window, thoughtfully looking out at the small garden that she had so diligently kept in order all these years. In recent years, she increasingly felt that something important was missing from her life. Her hands, cracked from age and housework, held tightly to the cup of tea she drank every morning. There were old photographs on the table next to her, which she sorted through, remembering her youth, those days when she and Henry were young, full of energy and passion. Henry, meanwhile, was sitting in an armchair in the living room, reading a newspaper. His movements were slow, almost lazy. There was no longer the fire in his eyes that had once attracted Rose. He was a good husband, always supported her, worked, took care of the family. But the years they spent together made their relationship more of a habit than something lively and exciting. Every morning was like the previous one. Henry woke up, drank coffee, read the newspaper, and Rose cooked breakfast and took care of the house. They lived like a couple who had long been accustomed to their rhythm, without asking unnecessary questions and without expecting changes. But Rose couldn't ignore the emptiness that was growing inside her. She felt that her loneliness was becoming more tangible every day, despite the fact that Henry was always there. Once they talked a lot, joked, and shared their dreams. Now the conversations were reduced to everyday issues: who's going to the store or how are the kids doing? She tried to find in their communication what had once connected them, but everything seemed cold and distant. The passion that once burned between them has disappeared, giving way to calmness and routine.
Henry, can you hear me?
He slowly turned his head in her direction, frowning slightly, as if trying to remember what she was talking about. His hearing was no longer as sharp as it used to be, and he needed more time to focus on the words.
What did you say, Rose?
She sighed, pushing the cup of tea aside, and sat down opposite him. There was fatigue in her eyes, but not physical, but emotional. She needed to say something, even though she didn't really know how to express her feelings herself.
I'm saying that we barely talk. Do you notice that? We live in the same house, but I feel that you are somewhere far away.
Henry looked at her over the top of his glasses, shrugging slightly.
We've always been like that, Rose. You know that. We've been together for so many years that we know each other better than anyone else. Doesn't that mean something?
She nodded in agreement, but it didn't make her heart feel any better. Of course, they had been together for many years, but that didn't mean that she no longer needed the emotional closeness, the very fire that had once been between them. Rosa was trying to figure out how they had gotten to this state, how the passion that had once been a central part of their relationship had disappeared, leaving only habits.
Yes, we know each other. But when was the last time we just sat and talked about how we felt? When was the last time you looked at me the way you used to?
Henry narrowed his eyes slightly, as if his words hurt a little, but he didn't say anything. It was a common thing for him. They had lived together all their lives. He thought they had already reached the stage where words were not so important. After all, the main thing is to be close, to support each other, and not to experience the passions of youth. But that wasn't enough for Rose. Everything around them now reminded Rose of how much they had lost over the years. Their house, once filled with the noise of children, has become quiet. The dinner they used to cook together turned into another commitment. Rose used to cook with pleasure, knowing that Henry would always appreciate her efforts, but now each meal became another item in the schedule, which they performed automatically. She looked at her husband, and a feeling of longing grew in her heart, longing for the days when she felt wanted, needed, when she knew that there was a connection between them, not only physically but also emotionally. Now, that connection seemed to be breaking under the weight of time and fatigue. One evening, when Rosa was washing the dishes after dinner, she caught her reflection in the window. Her wrinkled face looked tired and old. She knew that the years had not spared her, but inside she still had a desire to feel alive. She remembered when she and Henry were young. They could talk for hours, walk under the moon, and dream about the future. These memories became a life-saving straw for her in the ocean of routine life, but every year they moved further away. Rose began to spend more time alone with herself, thinking about how her life would change if she and Henry could regain what was lost. But she understood that every year it became less and less possible. They were both getting older, and their needs changed with age. Henry was pleased with their measured life. It was enough for him that they were together under the same roof. But Rose couldn't accept it. She wanted more, that feeling of intimacy that makes her heart beat faster. Sometimes, in the evening, when they were watching TV, Rose tried to remember the last time she and Henry had laughed together like before. But all she could remember were ordinary days filled with worries about the house, finances and health. Henry was reliable, caring, but their bond was fading, and she didn't know how to get it back. One day she dared to ask herself the question, could anything change their lives at all? Can the feeling that once united them return? Or was it a natural aging process that just needed to be accepted? She wasn't sure of the answer, but she knew one thing: she needed to change something. Anxiety was brewing in her soul, a desire to find what was lost, but she did not know where to look. These thoughts did not leave her, and one day, against the background of growing loneliness, her brother called her. Walter, her older brother, whom she had not seen for several years, announced that he was returning to their hometown after the death of his wife. This news caused mixed feelings in Rose. She was glad to meet him, but at the same time, memories of those years when they were young and close surfaced. Perhaps his appearance would be the change that had been maturing in her heart for so long. It's been a few days since Rose received a call from Walter. Several months have passed since the death of his wife Mary, and he decided to move back to his hometown. This news came as a surprise to Rosa. She did not expect that Walter, her brother with whom she had once been so close, would reappear in her life. Their childhood was intense and bright. They shared all the joys and sorrows with each other, often running away from home to spend time together in the backyard or in an abandoned park nearby. But adult years, marriage and life difficulties gradually separated them. When Rosa received the news of his move, her heart was filled with mixed feelings. She was glad that Walter would be there, but at the same time she was worried. Their relationship has changed markedly in recent decades. Family events and personal problems have alienated them from each other. Walter has always been a bit of an independent, strange man who avoided being too deeply attached. After he married Mary, his communication with Rose became increasingly rare. But now that Mary was gone, Rose felt his loss as her own. She knew that Walter's life would never be the same, and somewhere in the back of her mind she hoped that they would be able to return those moments of intimacy that they had in their youth. The day Walter was supposed to arrive was grey and rainy. Rosa stared out the window for a long time, waiting for his car. She had prepared a guest room, although Walter intended to rent an apartment nearby. Henry was at home, but he didn't care. He only nodded when Rosa mentioned that her brother was coming today. After a while, Rosa heard the sound of an engine outside the window. She looked out and saw an old car slowly pulling up to their house. Walter was driving. Rose felt her heart begin to beat faster. Her brother is back. Joy and anxiety mixed inside her. She quickly went to the door and opened it as soon as Walter got out of the car. He looked just as she remembered him. He was tall, slightly stooped, with short grey hair. His eyes, always shrewd, now reflected the weariness of life.
Rose, hello.
His voice was calm, a little rough, but full of warmth. He was always like that, outwardly restrained, but inside he carried deep feelings.
Walter, I'm so glad to see you.
She stepped forward, hugging him. He returned the hug, albeit a little stiffly, as if he wasn't sure how to behave in this new situation for both of them. But it was a familiar feeling when they stood together, as they once did.
I'm glad to be here again. Still, this is my home.
They went inside. Rosa invited him to sit in the living room, and she went to the kitchen for coffee. Henry was still sitting with a newspaper, with only a slight nod in Walter's direction when he entered. A few minutes later, Rosa returned with 2 cups of coffee and sat down next to her brother. She stared at him intently, trying to read in his eyes how he was coping with the loss. But Walter was always the one who hid his feelings deep inside.
How are you, Walter? How are you holding up?
He took a sip of coffee and, after a pause, replied,
In different ways, to be honest. Sometimes it feels like I'm coping, and sometimes it all comes together at once. But I decided that I needed to start over. That's why I came back here. Everything is familiar here. The native places are here.
She understood him. The loss of Mary, his wife for many decades, was a heavy blow. She and Rose had been apart for many years, but she always knew that Mary was the person who gave Walter stability. Now that she was gone, Rosa felt that her brother was more lonely than ever.
I'm glad you're back. I missed you, Walter.
He nodded, without taking his eyes off his cup. This moment was difficult for both of them. They lost a lot of time, missed the years they could have spent together. And now that they were back together, they had to get to know each other anew. Several minutes passed in silence before Walter finally looked up at her.
And how are you, Rosa? How are things with you and Henry?
Her heart sank. This seemingly simple question awakened in her all the pain that she hid behind her daily duties and habits. How could she tell him that her marriage had not brought her joy for a long time? That she feels lonely even being with her husband?
We're fine. At least that's how it should be.
Walter looked at her carefully, as if he wanted to say something, but changed his mind. He knew Rosa too well not to notice that there was more behind her words than she was saying, but he didn't insist. Over the next few days, Walter often came to visit. They talked a lot, recalled their youth, and shared stories about how the world around them had changed. The time they spent together filled Rose with a sense of warmth and intimacy that she missed so much. Walter reminded her of the days when life was simpler, when they could laugh without thinking about the future. One evening, when Henry was already asleep, Walter and Rose were sitting in the backyard, watching the stars. The air was cool, and Rose wrapped herself in an old woolen blanket. She felt calm around her brother, but at the same time she felt the growing tension. Their conversations increasingly turned to personal topics, those that they had avoided at first.
You know, Rose, I'm glad we're back together. I've been thinking a lot about the past, about how we lost contact.
Rose nodded, her eyes fixed on the stars.
I've been thinking about it too. We've missed a lot of time, but now you're here and it's important.
She didn't say out loud that there was something new in her life with his return, something she hadn't felt in years. The closeness with Walter, their shared past, their childhood, all this stirred up old feelings in her that she could not pinpoint. All she knew was that she felt alive again next to him. Every day Walter became an increasingly important part of her life. Their conversations, their walks, their laughter, all this made her think about what she was missing in her relationship with Henry. Her marriage seemed increasingly empty to her against the background of the bond that had resumed between her and her brother. Weeks passed, and Rose began to realize that her feelings for Walter were becoming more complicated than just the joy of returning a loved one. She was drawn to him more and more, and she couldn't ignore it. It was dangerous territory that she couldn't explain to herself, much less to anyone else. It's been a few weeks since Walter returned to his hometown. Every day Rose felt his presence becoming more and more important to her. They spent more and more time together, and their communication filled her life with meaning, which she had long lacked. With Henry, her conversations were rare and shallow, and with Walter she felt the closeness they shared as children, when they could talk about everything. These moments reminded her of how she used to be before her marriage to Henry turned her life into a chain of routine duties. Walter often came to their house, and although Henry did not show much interest in his visits, he did not mind. Henry, immersed in his usual activities, reading newspapers, watching the news and taking occasional walks, did not seem to notice that important changes were taking place between Rose and her brother. Of course, they started with memories of childhood, how their parents fought for survival in difficult times, how they ran away together to play in an abandoned park, and how they shared secrets that they did not share with anyone else. One day, when they were sitting in the backyard of Rose and Henry's house, with cups of tea in their hands, the conversations returned to their youth. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, and the air was filled with the scent of mown grass. The singing of birds and the soft breeze created ideal conditions for a quiet conversation full of nostalgia.
Do you remember those summer evenings when we ran down into the river just to sit by the water and chat about the future? We had so many dreams back then. It seemed like the whole world was lying at our feet.
Rose smiled at the warm sunset. Her eyes were a little moist, but they were tears of joy from the memories.
How can I forget this? I remember you telling me about your plans to leave the city, travel the world. You've always been full of ideas and desires. I thought back then that you could really make all your dreams come true.
Yeah, youthful optimism. Life turned out to be more difficult than I expected. Although I have done a lot, it seems to me that those years were the real ones. No worries, no obligations.
Rose stared at him, feeling his words echo in her soul. Walter was not just a brother to her, he was a part of her past, a version of herself that did not yet know what responsibility meant, what duty to her family meant, what lost love meant.
And I always thought that you could achieve anything you wanted. You were so determined, so determined. I was even a little jealous of you back then.
Walter frowned slightly, as if thinking about something important.
But in the end, I didn't go far. Got married and asked like everyone else. You know, life has a weird sense of humor. We plan one thing, but fate decides something completely different for us.
These words made Rosa think about her life. She remembered how in her youth she dreamed of becoming an artist, how she wanted to travel the world and paint landscapes. But then Henry came along, family responsibilities began, and her dreams dissolved into reality. Her life with Henry had always been simple and stable, but it lacked the fire that burned in her soul when she was young.
And I wanted to be an artist. I dreamed of traveling, painting, but then everything has changed.
You never told me about it.
This is a long forgotten story. I gave up these dreams when I got married. Family, children, home, it has become more important.
Walter looked at her with surprise and some regret. He never knew that Rosa, his sister, also had her ambitions, her dreams, which she sacrificed for the sake of the family. And this realization made him think about how much they had both lost over the years.
You were talented, Rosa. Your drawings have always surprised me. I remember how you could sit for hours with a pencil in your hands and create something magical.
Rose nodded, but her smile was sad. These memories reminded her of something she could no longer bring back. Dreams that were never realized became only echoes of the past, and real life swallowed her whole.
Life goes on as usual, Walter. And maybe my dreams shouldn't have come true. I did what I had to do, and in the end, it's not that bad.
But despite these words, sadness was beginning to form in her soul. The sadness that she never tried to fight for her desires, that she gave herself completely to her family, forgetting who she once was. And now, at 68, she felt that something was lost forever. Their conversations became more explicit every day. They recalled the moments that shaped their personalities, the first successes and defeats, youthful infatuations, experiences. They were memories that brought to life those parts of Rose that she thought had long since faded away. Every conversation with Walter made her feel like the young girl she once was again, the one who had dreams, ambitions, and a passion for life. One evening, when Rose was cooking dinner, Walter came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, watching her busy at the stove.
It's probably been a long time since you've cooked for two with such pleasure. It feels like you're coming to life next to something familiar. You remember the days when you and I were young and carefree.
Rose stopped and thought for a moment. He's right. She really felt more alive lately, but why? Maybe it wasn't just the memories. Maybe she was attracted to Walter not only because of the past, but also because their communication gave her a sense of intimacy that she had long lost in her marriage to Henry.
Yes, maybe I really remember those times. Sometimes it seems to me that the past was better than the present. But you know, Walter, I can't help but admit that communication with you, it makes me feel alive again.
Walter looked at her with a warm smile.
You've always been special, Rose. And for me, these conversations are also something more than just memories. This is what makes us who we are. We've always been close.
Rose felt her heart tighten. His words resonated in her soul. In recent years, she has been deprived of the emotional intimacy that was so important to her. Henry was a good husband, but their relationship became mechanical. And next to Walter, she felt important, needed, alive again. Several days have passed, and their bond has only grown stronger. They walked together through the old places, laughing at their youthful follies, and Rose began to realize that her feelings for her brother had become much more complicated than just a kindred affection. She was beginning to feel something more for him than just the closeness of two people sharing the same life. It was a frightening but exciting feeling at the same time. She knew she had gone too far in her thoughts. Her heart beat faster every time they were near. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that these were just memories, it was more than that. She knew that their relationship had gone beyond the past. Rose and Walter crossed the line that evening, when the tension between them became unbearable. It all started out like an ordinary day, but there was an inexplicable intimacy in the air that deepened with every look, every word. It was more than just a family connection. It was on the verge of something they both understood but were afraid to admit. The emotions that they had been holding back for a long time finally broke out, and their connection turned into something more dangerous and deeper. This moment happened without words as they sat in the backyard, as they have done many times in recent weeks. The sun was setting, enveloping them in a warm golden light, but conflicting feelings raged inside both of them. At first it was just an innocent gesture. Their hands touched each other, a little longer than the situation required. But at that moment, everything changed. Rose felt her heart beat faster, and when she looked at Walter, she saw in his eyes something she hadn't seen in Henry's eyes for a long time: desire, understanding, intimacy. This gesture became a catalyst for further action. Neither of them talked about what had happened, but they both knew that they had gone too far, and it couldn't be ignored anymore. Over the next few days, their relationship became even more complicated. They avoided each other's eyes, but every time their eyes met, there was a spark between them that was impossible not to notice. Walter was no longer just Rose's brother. He had become something much more to her. She began to realize that his presence in her life filled the void she had felt for many years. Their communication, their memories of the past, all this only increased her desire to be with him. She could no longer deny that she was attracted to him, despite all the consequences. A few days after that evening, Rose and Walter met alone in his apartment. Outwardly, it was an ordinary meeting. They continued to share memories of childhood, talk about how their lives had changed, but both knew that talking no longer kept them from what was maturing inside. Their eyes met more and more often, and the pauses between words became longer and deeper. They could no longer restrain themselves. Rosa, having difficulty coping with her inner torments, tried to convince herself that this was a temporary obsession, that all this would pass. But every time she was with Walter, her heart told her otherwise. She understood that these feelings would not disappear on their own, that they could not just be hidden. Everything that happened between them seemed to her both wrong and irresistibly attractive. Walter also felt the same struggle inside. He knew that their relationship was going too far, that they were betraying not only Henry, but also their own moral principles. He tried to talk himself out of what was happening, but every time he saw Rose, his resolve melted. Her presence filled him with a life he hadn't felt in a long time. After the death of his wife, he felt lonely, lost. Rose became his salvation, the only person who understood him. Their closeness became an important part of his life which he could no longer do without. And then one evening, after a long day, when Rose came to Walter again, their pent-up passion finally broke out. It wasn't planned, but deep down they both knew that this moment was inevitable. Their hands met again, but this time they didn't back down. That night, they crossed a line they couldn't afford. It was a moment of absolute unity, where their souls and bodies joined. But at the same time, a deep sense of guilt arose in their hearts. As soon as their passion faded, the realization of what they had done hit them with all its weight. They lay side by side in silence, each lost in his own thoughts, realizing that this step could not be turned back. Their lives have now changed forever. Wine has become a constant companion of Rosa. She couldn't look at Henry without feeling the weight of her betrayal. Every time she returned home after meeting Walter, she felt like she was destroying everything she and Henry had been building for decades. But despite that, she couldn't stop. The bond with Walter was too strong to just break it. Every time they met, their attraction only grew stronger, and each time they delved deeper into this forbidden relationship. They began dating in secret, carefully hiding their relationship from others. Rose tried to act with Henry as if nothing had changed, but it was getting harder every day. Henry did not suspect anything. He was immersed in his usual business, not noticing that his wife had not been the same for a long time. He was used to her presence, and it was enough for him that she was there. But Rose could no longer feel just around. She lived a double life, faced every day with the fact that her relationship with Walter contradicted all the norms and rules that she once considered important. With each new meeting, their relationship became more complicated. Walter, like Rose, understood that what they were doing was wrong, but the feeling that united them was stronger than their will. They tried to discuss it, tried to figure out how to stop, but every time they talked about it, their conversations ended with them giving in to their feelings again. Rose felt torn between two worlds. On the one hand, she continued her life with Henry, trying to maintain the appearance of a normal relationship. She cooked for him, took care of the house, but inside she had a growing feeling that she was betraying him more and more every day. On the other hand, her connection with Walter became what gave her the meaning of life, what made her feel alive. She knew it was ruining her marriage, but she couldn't do anything about it. One night, when she returned home again after meeting Walter, Rose stopped in front of the mirror in her bedroom. She stared at her reflection for a long time, trying to figure out who she had become. Her face, lined with wrinkles, seemed alien to her. She saw a woman who had lost herself in her own life, a woman who no longer knew what was right and what was wrong. It was a feeling of absolute loss of control over one's own destiny. But despite this realization, she continued to date Walter. There was no future in their relationship, but every moment spent with him seemed real to her, alive. It was something she had been missing for years, and she couldn't just give it up, even knowing that it was all leading to disaster. Walter also felt the weight of guilt. He understood that his relationship with Rosa could not last indefinitely, that sooner or later it would all collapse. He tried to tell her that they needed to stop, but every time he said that, their eyes would meet and it would start all over again. They were like two souls who had lost themselves in this whirlwind of feelings and emotions from which they could not get out. Their life turned into a secret game where every step was steeped in guilt and passion. They understood that they had destroyed the boundaries that had once been inviolable, but they could no longer go back. Every meeting with Walter made their relationship even more difficult, and every night spent with Henry reminded Rose that she had betrayed everything she had built over the years. That's how their betrayal began, full of pain, passion, and guilt. Henry has always been a man of habit. His life had long been rooted in a routine that brought him a sense of stability and peace. A morning coffee, a newspaper, or walk around the block, all this gave him a sense of control over his life, even when it became more predictable and less intense. The relationship with Rosa also entered into this rhythm. After decades of marriage, they no longer needed words in order to maintain domestic harmony. But every day Henry noticed more and more that something had changed in their family. At first it was the little things. Rosa, who was always there, began to leave the house more and more often. She found things to do in the city that did not exist before: shopping trips, meetings with friends, visits to the library. Her explanations were always convincing, and Henry didn't pay much attention to them at first. He was sure that his wife was just looking for new activities in their adulthood. But then he noticed something that excited him. Rosa stopped behaving as usual. She became more distracted, often nervous. Her gaze began to wander when they were sitting at the table, and the phone was always nearby, as if she was waiting for some important message or call. Doubts began to creep quietly into Henry's mind. At first, he did not want to believe that his faithful wife could hide something important from him, But his intuition told him that everything was not so simple. The outward signs of her anxiety became all too obvious. She became more and more withdrawn, each time finding excuses not to spend time with him. Henry decided not to press her, believing that if something was wrong, she would have told him herself. But for weeks the situation only worsened, and his patience began to run out. One of the turning points for Henry was the day he accidentally overheard Rose talking on the phone. She was talking quietly, as if trying not to be overheard, but Henry was in the next room and caught a few words. There was nothing obviously suspicious about this conversation, but the intonation of her voice, warm and tense at the same time, made him tense up. It was more than just an ordinary conversation, and that's when the realization began to grow in his mind. Something was happening, and it had something to do with Walter. Walter, Rosa's brother, was a frequent visitor to their house. Ever since he moved to the city after the death of his wife, Henry tried to be friendly to him, realizing how hard it was for Walter to be alone. But as Rosa's relationship with Walter grew closer, Henry began to notice their strange closeness. He caught them looking at each other several times, which lasted longer than they should have. Their conversations, which seemed innocent to him, sometimes resembled something more than just communication between brother and sister. But Henry pushed these thoughts away from himself, considering them too absurd. After all, it was unthinkable that his wife and her brother could feel anything more than kinship for each other. But one evening, when Rose left once again, saying that she was going to meet a friend, Henry felt strangely uneasy. He couldn't explain to himself why, but something inside him told him she was lying. He usually trusted her implicitly, but something changed that night. He decided to check if she had actually met her friend. After running through the phone contacts of their mutual acquaintances, he called one of Rosa's friends to confirm her words. The answer was short and sharp. Rosa had not met them. Henry felt his world begin to crumble. He didn't know what to think. He couldn't believe that Rosa could lie to him. It was too unbelievable. But the fact remained that his wife was not where she said she was. His heart ached, but with it came the determination to find out the truth. At that moment, Henry made a decision that would change everything. He decided to follow her. The next morning, Rosa said again that she needed to go out for a meeting. Henry nodded calmly, as if he didn't suspect anything. But as soon as she left the house, he took his jacket and followed her, keeping his distance. He was not a professional investigator, but his heart told him that he had to find out the truth. Rose reached the outskirts of the city where Walter's apartment was located. Henry stopped at the corner of the street and watched as his wife went to the door and quickly went inside. This moment was for him the confirmation of all his worst suspicions. He didn't need any more explanations. Everything fell into place. Henry stood outside for a few minutes trying to collect his thoughts. His heart was beating with such force that it seemed as if he was about to fall from the impact. The same question kept ringing in my head. How could he couldn't understand how the people he considered closest to him could betray him. How could his wife's brother do such a mean thing? How could Rosa, the woman he had lived with all his life, hide such a monstrous betrayal from him? Summoning all his resolve, Henry headed for the door. He couldn't stand this lie anymore. He had to face the truth face to face, no matter how terrible it was. After knocking on the door, he heard someone approaching it from inside. A moment later, the door opened and Rose stood in front of him. She froze when she saw him on the threshold. Her eyes widened in horror. She knew that he understood everything. Walter was standing behind her, and his face was just as pale and startled. Henry's world collapsed at that moment. Everything he had built for decades, everything he had considered unshakable, was now destroyed. His wife and her brother, the two people he trusted most in the world, turned out to be traitors. He could no longer hide his rage, pain, and disappointment. The words poured out of his mouth with such force that he couldn't even control himself. The quarrel that followed this moment was violent and destructive. Henry shouted at Rosa, accusing her of ruining their lives, betraying his trust. He couldn't believe she could do such a thing. In his eyes, she was no longer the woman he loved. She became a symbol of his pain and disappointment. Walter, despite his attempt to explain himself, was just a quiet observer of this scene, realizing that he could not justify himself. He knew he had made an irreparable mistake, but there was nothing he could do about it. Rosa, despite her attempts to explain everything, understood that she could not return anything. Henry was too deeply wounded. The trust he had held in her all these years had been shattered. She knew she had betrayed him, but she couldn't change what had already happened. Her guilt, which she had been hiding for all these months, now completely consumed her. Henry, unable to stand this scene, left the apartment. He went outside, feeling like his world had been destroyed to the ground. Everything he believed in was destroyed in an instant. His family, his marriage, his trust in his loved ones, everything was destroyed. He couldn't stay around these people anymore. He left without looking back, leaving Rose and Walter in their own thoughts and regrets. For Rosa, this moment was a turning point. She realized that her betrayal had not only destroyed her relationship with Henry, but also destroyed her connection with herself. She could no longer look at herself in the mirror without feeling guilty. Her life was now filled with pain and regret, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Walter, realizing that his relationship with Rosa was wrong from the very beginning, also realized his guilt. He understood that he had betrayed his brother and destroyed everything that could be valuable to him in life. After the exposure, when Henry left, leaving Rose and Walter alone in their heavy silence, Rose's life changed dramatically. Her world, which had been stable for a long time, albeit empty, was now destroyed. The house that had once been her refuge became a reminder of pain, betrayal, and her own mistakes. At that moment, she realized that the consequences of her actions were inevitable and inexorable, and it was almost impossible to find a way back. Henry left that day and never came back. He didn't shout or make a scene. His silence and leaving said much more. It was too painful for him. His heart was broken not only because of Rosa's betrayal, but also because this betrayal came from her brother, a man whom he trusted as a family. Henry couldn't live with this load, and so he left, leaving Rose alone with her guilt and doubts. For the first time after he left, the house seemed empty and cold to Rosa. She was used to Henry's presence, even if their communication had become sparse and superficial. His absence was like a ringing void into which she plunged headlong. All those things that once seemed insignificant, the sound of his footsteps, his quiet comments about the news, even his habits that irritated her, have now become an irreparable loss. Rosa realized that her betrayal was the final blow in their relationship. At first, she thought that she could still fix something, that Henry might have just walked away to cool off and come to his senses. But every day his absence became more tangible and final. He didn't answer her calls or texts. Her attempts to get in touch with him through friends or children did not lead to anything. He distanced himself from her so much that Rose began to realize that he might not be coming back. At the same time, Rose felt that her relationship with Walter could not continue either. After their relationship was revealed, all the romance and passion they had for each other turned into a bitter realization of how destructive their actions were. What had once seemed alive, real, and sincere to her was now overshadowed by guilt and the realization that they had hurt Henry. Walter tried to talk to her several times, tried to find words to explain or justify their relationship, but Rose couldn't look at him the way she used to. Every time they were together, she saw not only her brother, but also the man who ruined her marriage. Their relationship has become a heavy burden for her. With each passing day, Rosa became more and more immersed in thinking about her choice. She began to ask herself questions. Why did she do this? Why did she allow herself to be carried away by feelings that shouldn't have arisen? She realized that her emotional emptiness, her loneliness and estrangement with Henry had pushed her down this path. But that could not be an excuse. A conflict between guilt and regret flared up in her heart. She was trying to remember when everything went wrong in her marriage to Henry. When they stopped being a couple, when they stopped seeing each other. Perhaps this happened after the children grew up and left home. Perhaps it happened even earlier, when everyday life and routine began to consume their relationship. She couldn't say exactly when their love faded, but she realized that for many years they had lived as two parallel worlds, intersecting only on a household level. Now Rosa realized that her connection with Walter was not so much an expression of passion as an attempt to fill the void that she had felt for many years. She was looking for understanding, emotional intimacy, which she had long lost with her husband. Walter became the person with whom she could feel alive again. But this connection was false, destructive. Now she saw that their relationship could not bring her the happiness she craved. The days passed in thought and solitude. Rosa tried to find the strength to figure out what to do next. She was torn between two worlds. On the one hand, she had Henry, the man she had lived with for decades, the father of her children, her life partner. On the other hand, there was Walter, her brother, the man who filled her life with new emotions but also caused its destruction. Rosa understood that her choice would now determine the rest of her life. The problem was that she didn't know how to start rebuilding what had been destroyed. How can you regain the trust of a man who has been betrayed so deeply? How can you bring back a love that seemed to have faded away forever? She thought about trying to talk to Henry, ask for forgiveness, explain her feelings. But every time she thought about taking this step, she was overcome with fear. What if he refuses to listen to her? What if his heart was already closed to her forever? At the same time, Rose began to realize that continuing a relationship with Walter was impossible. What began as something that brought her joy and comfort has now become a source of pain and fear for her. She could no longer see in Walter the man she loved like a brother. Their relationship destroyed not only her marriage, but also their family relationship. Seeing him now made her feel ashamed and regretful. She understood that their relationship was a mistake from the very beginning. One day, sitting in the backyard of their house, Rosa began to realize that all that remained of her former life were regrets and lost opportunities. She remembered how she and Henry, when they were young, dreamed of growing old together, how they would sit in the same backyard, watching their grandchildren play in the garden. Now this garden seemed empty and gloomy to her. Instead of the happiness and peace they had once planned, there was only bitterness left in her life. Rose wondered if it was even possible to rebuild what had been destroyed. Is it possible to regain trust when it has been betrayed so deeply? Can love resurrect after such a blow? She didn't know the answers to these questions, but she knew she had to at least try. She needed to make up for her guilt to Henry somehow, if only so that she wouldn't feel completely lost. She decided to write a letter to Henry. It was a difficult decision, but she felt she had no other choice. She tried to be sincere in her letter. She described her feelings, her loneliness, her regret. She didn't ask for forgiveness directly because she understood that he might never be able to forgive her. She just wanted him to know that she realized her mistake and was ready to accept any consequences. Rosa did not know if she would receive a reply to her letter, but after sending it, she felt some relief. This was her first step towards admitting her guilt and starting the process of inner healing. Several weeks passed, but there was no response from Henry. Rosa was not surprised by this. She understood that he might never be able to forgive her. She continued to live in a house that now seemed alien to her, filled with shadows of the past. Walter never came to see her again. They both realized that their relationship could not continue. Rosa didn't hold a grudge against him, but she knew she couldn't be with him anymore. Now that she was alone, Rosa began to wonder what made old age so difficult. This is not only physical withering or the loss of loved ones, it is also those mistakes that cannot be corrected. Old age forces you to face the consequences of decisions made in the past, and often these decisions cannot be reversed. Her betrayal of Henry had been one of those mistakes, and now she had to live with that burden. Rose didn't know if she would ever find peace. Perhaps her life would always be filled with regrets and pain now. But despite this, she felt that her only hope was to try to find the strength inside herself to move on. Life has never been easy, and her mistakes have become a part of this life. Now she had to find a way to move forward, despite all that she had lost. Rosa's story ended on a note of reflection on what was destroyed and what may never be restored. But deep down in her soul, there was still a faint hope that, even despite the mistakes she had made, life could still offer her a chance for redemption and forgiveness.